morning. My name is Ali Akram.
My name is Maira Hayat.
And we're here to talk about water in Pakistan as part of the Pakistan at 100 podcast series. Maira, you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So I recently finished my PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago, and I'm just starting a postdoc at Stanford.
Not too shabby.
Yeah. Right. And my undergrad was at LUMS. I did a master's before that also in anthro. My dissertation was titled Ecologies of Water Governance in Pakistan, the Colony, the Corporation and the Contemporary.
Great. We'll hope to dip into some insights from that during our talk. Nice. My name is Ali Akram and I am an assistant professor in the economics department at LUMS. I'm a bit older than you. I finished my PhD in 2014 in environmental economics, and I look predominantly at water resources, both as it pertains to public health and in agriculture. So let's get started with our conversation. So, Maira, as we were driving over here, we were talking about the fact that there's all these alarming headlines these days. In Pakistan, it's just the word on everybody's mind is crisis. And you do a Google search, the words you type are Pakistan water, and the third word that it autofills for you is crisis. So clearly there's this alarm in the country. There's a belief that we're kind of running out of water. Numbers are bandied about, 2025 will run out, 2040 will run out of water. And it does express itself in some places. You go to Karachi and people are paying a lot of money for water, be it from the lowest sort of income segments to the highest income segments. People pay something like 5,000 rupees for a tanker of water that lasts you about a week. So you're spending $250,000 rupees on water. So it does feel a bit crisis-like. I think I'm a bit more optimistic. I don't think we're quite at crisis yet. But there is action happening, right? We've got a Supreme Court that's raising crowdfunding for a dam, and so there's this distinct feeling of crisis. I was thinking, so like I said, I don't think I'm a bit more of an optimist. I don't think there's a crisis per se. And I do see that it's maybe just about sharing what we've got a bit better. In my fantasy, I see farmers selling water to cities, if cities are running short, then maybe the better use is for farmers to sell it to them. But that's a fantasy, and it's a long way off. And I think there's this institutional reality we run aground into. You had some insights on that. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think the crisis point is really interesting, that I think it's fairly recent, and I think it also has to do with the timing of certain key publications in creating the sense of a crisis, right? So, the go-to point for a lot of people is the 2005 World Bank report.
I was just going to say, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I
so
think
there's
that set this whole thing in motion, right?
Then I think a few years later, you have a Brookings Institution report. Then you have some publications, I think, by the Asian Water Development Outlook. And then also, if you just look at regular newspaper headlines, right? Local newspapers in Pakistan, headlines such as Pakistan wastes X amount of dollars by dumping water into the Arabian Sea, right? So there's a sense of this very valuable resource that's just running
Slipping
to
away
waste,
from us,
right? So yes, that this sense of crisis is. I think these kinds of publications show you how the sense comes to be. You see it around you. It's being talked about. These organizations that command a lot of prestige are producing these authoritative-looking documents that are, then cited by people. So their intercitationality practices are also really interesting.
There's this momentum developing.
So there's that, and I think also very recently, with the whole crowdfunding of the dam. I've been watching television at home this past month, and every few minutes there's this, public service message. So if I just even if the television's on mute, you know that something big is happening. And I guess I just want to add here that one of the things to me, what is of interest here is that something to a certain part of the population has become perceptible now, right? But of course, it's not to say that there were not water problems before, right? Like people who haven't had access to regular clean water sources.
Right. So this would be the poorest in our country, for example, like the poorest in urban settings. Or Karachi has seen this crisis for a very long time, in fact. So it's not necessarily a new thing, but there's a lot of hype now.
There's a lot of hype, and again here, I mean, it's interesting to try to understand why at this particular moment water is being framed like this, the conversation around water is being framed like this. I mean, of course, I think some of it also has to do with international level things, right? Like election timings in India and Pakistan, the kind of rhetoric that then you see developing around water issues, blood and water don't flow together. Oh well, we have a crisis situation. And I just, historically, because some of my dissertation work, I did some archival research for it, and so the 1960s, that moment is also particularly interesting here, because in the 60s and through the 70s, there's also talk of a water crisis. And there the crisis is not one of scarcity. It's not one of population growth, hence water availability being reduced. It's very much it's a twin menace of waterlogging and salinity, right? Everyone's upset about waterlogging, salinity, so you have a lot of international money also coming in, right? You will fix this. How will you fix this problem? Reclaim land.
For agriculture.
For agriculture, right? And also, my sense from looking at some of this archival material and some of the published material on this is that one of the things that gets lost in conversations on policy making around water in Pakistan is that this twin menace of waterlogging and salinity then in Pakistan was very much a West Pakistan problem. Right? And so
back when it was a larger two-winged Pakistan, right? Yes.
And the problem of floods was very much the problem in East Pakistan. So for me, it was very revelatory when I looked at some National Assembly debates from the 60s. If you look at the exchanges that are happening between members of the Assembly from East and West Pakistan, then East and West Pakistan, there's a lot of ill will and a lot of questioning and skepticism around this massive funding that will follow after the treaty is signed. That there's all this water development stuff that is focused on West Pakistan, but what about the flood problem in East Pakistan? Right. So there's I think it's important to remember that as a country, there have been water crises in the past, and I think there are really important lessons there.
So I was going to ask you. I mean, so there's water sharing. Like, so I said, there's this fantasy I have where maybe there's this kind of ability to move around water in a kind of a market fashion, and if some urban center is running low, then some rural center can sell water. But I mean, that speaks more broadly to the idea of sharing our water, and provinces have to share water. There's some kind of sharing agreement. I mean, going back to what you just said about this talking at cross purposes and not really listening to each other, this moment in history back in the day when there was another technical problem with water, and there was all sorts of trouble with that. So what do you think is one big lesson? Like, I think that idea of, as an economist, I always think price, right? Market, that's going to solve things. But obviously that runs aground into the institutional reality that we live in. So what do you think, like, is there some big lesson over there for us? Like, what would it be? Like, what is it that we should be cognizant of or be thinking about when we think about sharing better? What do you think?
Right. I think one of the things there is to, and I say this in particular because this is one of the things that I came across most frequently when I was doing my, dissertation work, was there's a lot of people in water circles, so irrigation people, a lot of engineers that I did my work with. Generally, they're upset that politics is getting in the way. And the problem is that we've politicized the issue, hence we can't build a dam. We've politicized the issue, hence we can't get pricing right. We've, because it's become such a political matter, our Biana rates are skewed. So, if we were to accept that water is a political issue, what happens to policy making then? If the starting point of the realization is that this is what it is, right? That there is no ideal starting point where everybody will agree that, you know, there's this core to the problem which has nothing to do with politics.
Right.
But if you realize, if we accept that it is a political issue, how then do we go around trying to make water distribution better?
Right.
How do we then try and make water sharing better?
Right.
Right, and then, because then if you're recognizing something as political, as fundamentally political, then there's of course more room for dialogue, right?
Right.
You can debate, you can actually have conversations, there can be back and forth.
Right.
There will not be consensus.
Right.
But then what happens then? Sure, there isn't consensus.
Right. But in that sort of conflict
Right.
sort of setting, how do you...
Right.
That's an interesting point, you know. I mean, I think it's a really interesting sort of kind of cleavage that you've picked up, that you've highlighted here, sorry, not picked up, highlighted here, which is that there's technocrats and there's
Right.
people with this engineering, and I mean, even like I'll count myself as a, you know, as a sort of a technical person. I think of these ideals, and yes, like for me, like I said, it's a water market, and the engineers will say, you build a dam this way, it's that efficient, it'll give us that much electricity, etc. If only these bureaucrats and politicians get out of our way, you know. But it's a really important realization. The fact is, we don't live in that first best world. We live in a second best world, and that's how we've got to sort of play out our policy and solutions. Yeah. So I was, on that note, I was going to sort of jump us to our, you know, what we'd, so in terms of how we thought we'd structure our conversation a bit, I thought we'd jump us to our next topic on urban water.
Right.
And that's another setting that really sees this divide between the ideal and kind of the actual reality, and you have to play with second best instruments. You don't get the best, you know. So just to kick us off here on urban water, you know, broadly there's two categories of urban water use. There's domestic use, what we use in the home for washing, cleaning, and our lawns or whatever it is, and then there's industrial use. That's, you know, from, I guess the easiest example would be soft drinks and bottled water. But industrial water use has, it's all, you know, I mean, water is used in many industrial processes. So those are the two big ones in the urban, what we call the urban sector. So turning our attention first to sort of domestic use, within domestic there's also this kind of cleavage. There's sort of the formal gridded water networks that supply water to households, and then there's these more informal sort of settings. So let's start with the formal, and the formal I think applies to a small chunk of the population in Pakistan. You know, the vast bulk of people are very poor and they don't have access to formal networks. It's a smaller chunk of the population, you know, higher income quintiles that get to see water come through a pipe into their house, right? And there, you know, so just going back to that earlier thought, where we mentioned Karachi and the fact that there's sort of crisis over there, right? You have to get these water tankers to come in and give you water, and people are paying a lot of money over there. But in much of the country, for example, you look at Lahore, and nobody's really paying for their water. And you know, I wish I knew the numbers better and I could quantify this. But just anecdotally, you know, the image that always comes to my mind is there's an older member of staff somewhere who's watering the driveway, and you're thinking, oh my God, all that water just is just flowing onto our driveway. What are we doing? But clearly, there's a lot of wastage in sort of domestic use, and I think there's two problems. The first is very fundamental. The first is that we're not metered. We don't have metering anywhere. We don't have metered domestic use. And so if you don't know how much you're using, you're not going to control it. The second sort of problem coupled on top of that is the fact that we don't price it. We can't price it because we haven't metered it, you know. So we don't know how much we're using, and because we don't know how much we're using, we can't price it appropriately. And again, you know, this is just the bias of my disciplinary training. Is I'm thinking, you price it right, and you'll get more rational use. So on that, you know, I kind of mentioned briefly to you earlier. You know, we've done this work recently. You know, we're in this second best setting. We're in a setting where we don't have meters, and we don't have prices. So just to be correct, actually, we have a version of prices.
Right.
It's this assessed tax. So
Right.
it depends on how many. I think there's this very archaic sort of conception where how many faucets you have in the house and how big your house is
Right.
determines this kind of quarterly or 2 monthly water tax that you pay.
Right,
But it's not
right,
volumetric,
right.
so there's no
No.
weights anywhere near kind of a fair price for it.
Right.
So here we are in this kind of second best setting. And so some colleagues of mine and I would thought, okay, well, what can we do? Like, how do we get people to sort of pull back on their water consumption? And so then you turn to these kind of non-price instruments, right? Like you turn to things, how do you reduce water consumption without having price? So even as researchers, we ran into the first problem, which is that, well, okay, maybe we can nudge the water consumption. We can maybe there's ways to reduce it, but then how are we going to measure that we actually got something, because there's no metering? So we sort of confronted by that same problem, even as researchers. But anyway, long story short, the point is that we figured out ways to sort of proxy measure the water consumption, and we tried these non-price ways to get people to reduce their water consumption, and it was all a bit flat. Like we didn't find much of anything. Like we had maybe it was a small experiment, so we couldn't pick up very small effects or something. But we tried these kind of behavioral nudges. We thought we'd get people to reduce their water consumption through appropriate messaging and the right graphics and the right this and the right that. But we didn't find much of anything. Like it didn't really move water consumption at all. So we're reassessing, like, what is it that we do in the second best setting? How do we get people to reduce their water consumption? So it's you're kind of stuck, and people, of course, there's international research that does suggest that you can nudge consumption, but there's that important difference. Almost every setting internationally has price to play with. There's some element of price in there.
So it's a combination.
It's not just that
No.
there's some nice moral messaging, but
right,
you've got price somewhere in the mix, so it makes a difference. So we need to walk our way towards price somehow.
Right. I think the price thing is really interesting. I know that we have a lot to say about it, especially when we get to when we get to agriculture, those models. So maybe I'll hold that thought for a while. But just to on this point about domestic consumption, that one of the things that I've been struck by, so this new phase of research, you could say, in a way, is where there's this part of Gulbarg that I've just begun some.
So Gulbarg is an area within
This
Lahore.
is in Lahore.
Yeah.
At one point, it was, I believe, the DHA of Lahore.
Right.
So this is where the elite of Lahore live, right? So we're talking about this. We're really talking about these two streets, about a 3-kilometer distance apart, right? So you have the front road, which is a proper Pakki road, old houses. Everybody gets pipes, and there's tap water. It's all in order. People have their own tankers. They do what people usually do.
So this is the formally served segment, right? Yeah.
Also, the other thing is that even within these formal settings, it's very, very common for houses to have their own pumps now.
Right. So a lot of people have dug their own wells.
Right. And also, I believe that there are some housing societies that forbid this. They don't allow it.
But that doesn't,
that you can't individually dig your own, pump. You can't install a pump.
Right.
But people are still doing it, right? Like houses do it. They have
so kind of flaunt the
rules.
Right.
Right. So this particular part, it's just 2 to 3 kilometers apart, and the divide is also very stark in that you have kothis here, and the domestic staff that works in those kothis, they live 3 kilometers apart, right?
Okay.
So more. The streets are narrower, buildings are tighter, they're higher, right? But even within one little building, there is so much heterogeneity. There's a tube well that Vasa installed at some point, many years ago.
By the way, and so just to be clear, you're talking about So now you were talking about this sort of lower income setting.
Right.
This building is in that lower income setting.
This building is in,
Okay.
is in that lower income setting. Many of the people there work as staff in these houses, right?
Okay.
Domestic staff in these houses. So there'll be drivers or there'll be cooks. Some of them are gardeners.
Right.
There's some of them cleaners.
Right.
So they will get their water from this. They travel. Many of them make trips twice a day. So they
Okay.
will collect the water from that tube well. They will use it, but then there are days, right? On some days they look at the water, they don't like it, it doesn't
Okay.
look good, then they boil it. How do they boil it if there's no gas? There's been a lot
Okay.
of gas load shedding.
Right.
So for instance, this one building, the landowner is somebody who knows somebody in Wapta who has helped them with a connection.
Electricity
Right,
connection.
with the electricity connection, which has helped somebody else on another floor of that building, a family that's not related to them, who has connection. Somebody in that family has connections with gas people.
Right.
So what's happened is that building gets uninterrupted gas supply. So
Okay.
even if the water here is dirty, even if it's smelly, this particular little building
Has gas.
to
So they can
boil the
their
water to clean it. They get hot water.
Interesting.
But so there's a lot of variation in heterogeneity,
Yeah.
which is I think very challenging.
Like building
right?
to
So this-
building, you can have
right,
changes in the
right,
water supply,
yeah,
the electricity supply, and the gas, and that
yeah.
makes a difference to what kind of water they get and whether they can treat it or not. Right.
And so I think it's a really it's a very important check on this tendency to generalize. And also
Absolutely.
that these informal settings, in these so-called informal settings, the kinds of hooks that people then need to have onto more formal institutions or arenas
Right.
or networks to
Right.
be able to access what needs to be accessed.
Right. I mean, this is a really interesting point about the heterogeneity. I think much of the population actually does not have gridded water access. They don't have access to a pipe network or even their own dug well or something, right, on property. Most people have all sorts of very informal and informal water arrangements, and that of course has big implications on quality, and I'll get to that in a second. But I recall the work I did in Karachi. I was working in a sort of slum squatter settlement.
And this is very recent. This is
This is a little dated. It's
Okay.
about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
But I do not think that things have changed.
Right.
We're starting some different work in another part of the city, another squatter settlement.
Okay.
But you see the same phenomena occurring. At least, like what I see
Right.
on the surface.
Right.
And what we had, what I saw was, like you had these donkey carts with these 300-gallon plastic water tanks going around, and people would come out and get their coolers of water and fill it up, and they'd pay money for that, good money for it. These, like the lowest sort of income quintiles are paying huge amounts of money for their drinking water. I mean, in fact, so that's when you spoke about this heterogeneity, and so the two thoughts that came to my mind were, one, that yes, there is great heterogeneity, and in fact the poorest often, and what that means is that the poorest often end up paying huge amounts of money, large parts of their incomes toward accessing water. The other sort of complementary, the related side of this is quality, and then I'll get to that in a second. But there's a lot of work, I think, within Pakistan, some of my own and that of others, that finds that households are, like, especially in lower income segments, like the bottom 2 quintiles of the income, bottom 2 income quintiles are willing to pay large amounts of money for high quality water service. That tells me that, if a water agency, a water and sanitation agency, or a local water authority wanted to formally extend water service to poorer parts of the city, they could actually finance it. Like, people are willing to pay a lot of money for water service. They want that. And I keep saying that the related side to this is quality. And so this was really interesting. You kind of had this nice merger when you were talking about this, of not just water, but what kind of water and how do you treat it. A lot of poor households don't treat their water, even though there are actually cheap ways to do it. And so there's this huge diarrheal disease burden that kills 125 to 150,000 Pakistani children under the age of 5 every year. That's a lot of children dying because of mostly poor quality drinking water. And there are easy ways to solve this, this water chlorination.
And these are other than boiling, right?
Yeah, boiling is actually pretty expensive, by the way. For a low-income household, boiling is expensive. Where do you get the gas from? And it's very special circumstances, right? Some guy knows some guy who can get him the gas to boil. But even if you do have it, it's still pretty expensive. So the cheapest thing you can do for a kind of a baseline of clean water, to at least bacterially decontaminate it, right? Get rid of the pathogens, is to put chlorine, which is dirt cheap. That's something like, it's less than 2 rupees or a rupee per liter or something even lower. It's something insanely low. Sorry, I'm misquoting, but it's something incredibly low. It's very low cost per liter. But getting people to chlorinate is tough,
Do you think a lot of people don't know this? Do you think people know that this is one easy way to
yes. Chlorination?
Because one thinks that that's an easy thing. If
Why
we
aren't they
have
doing
all
it?
these public service messages saying contribute your money
to
you
the
have
dam,
to make a big dam. This is so much easier.
Right? Just to prevent a lot of deaths, you could just get them to use chlorine. It turns out, and again, I don't wanna steal our thunder for later. We want to talk about technology adoption for agriculture, but this is a big problem. Like, it sounds pretty obvious, doesn't it? You just get people to use chlorine and they'll save a lot of children from dying. But it's not that easy. So in some work that I did earlier, we had this experiment where we provided free access to chlorine for everybody in our study sample. We said everybody gets free chlorine, okay? And so we had this control group and we had a treatment group. And the only difference between the control and the treatment was that the treatment, we fed back information to them. We fed back information on disease incidents to them. We said, recall in the last week how many days of diarrhea your child had. And we did this very regularly for a long period of time. And so what we found was that even though everybody had access to free chlorine, the control group also had free access to chlorine, the treatment were twice as likely to actually use it, because even with free provision, people hesitate, people are lazy, people don't care enough, it's not a big enough problem. You have to make it, you have to find some way to get them to use it, And it's not that easy, it's not trivial to just get them to use it. So you're right, like, wouldn't it be so nice if we could just, every 10th message on contributing to the dam was, and chlorinate your water, But I don't think it's that simple, although maybe that bumps up chlorine use. So so that's, that was kind of domestic water use. I wanted you to kind of set us up a little bit on industrial water use. You've done some work on that and some thinking on water use in the industry. And I, again, there's recently some interesting headlines where they're going after the big bottled water companies for you're not paying enough for the water you extract from our aquifer. So I wondered, do you have any sort of thoughts on industrial water use?
So one of the things that got me interested in this, right? So the project, the dissertation project is it's all irrigation bureaucracy. It's all about agricultural water use, and right, disputes around water sharing, varabandi problems, theft, and all. So the way that I got into this was on the question of how water is or is not or becomes a public good, a right, and what are these trends towards its commoditization, and what are the different ways that it is being commoditized, and what that does to the publicness of water. Right? And so the way that I started, I got into this by looking at some of the corporate social responsibility discourse around the bottled water industry. Right, and so for me, one of the things there was that, so for instance, now the industry has a new index. It's called the AWS, the Alliance for Water Stewardship is this organization, these big companies, and so they say we are going to do, more responsible business and right, how we do it.
And does that relate to water extraction?
And it relates to water extraction also because so it's a way that they define the sphere of influence, right? And I believe that some big companies here, like Nestle, for instance, has been at the forefront of these indices, right?
Okay.
And so for me, the question becomes that if these companies are deciding the spheres of influence, if they're deciding and determining and defining the sphere within which they are going to be responsible,
Yeah.
then the question arises, right? Who is this responsibility owed to? Who decides if this is enough? Where is the adjudication around
Right.
this?
Wait, adjudication. So are there circumstances where there's conflict about this? Like, I mean, I don't know, they're just pulling some water out of an aquifer or river. Is there possibilities of conflict?
So yes, and it's again in a very complicated way, right?
Okay.
So for instance, one of the companies, a water MNC, so where they're extracting from, the people close to that place are very happy. They're happy because
they get jobs.
look, they're giving us free water. They've set up these, clean water fountain tanks.
Right.
Right. So then again, the question becomes, but who decides if this is the sphere within which you have to make somebody happy, right?
Okay.
So, right, what does it matter if within a particular circumference people are happy?
Right.
But overall, the net effects after a little while, you will see problems, right?
Right.
And so people have reported things like tube wells are drying up. Drying up in the sense that people say if pehle our bore was at 300 feet, now some people are saying it's at 500 feet or something.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. So they have to
So
dig
of
deeper
course, when
for
you have
water,
these big corporate actors, they have big pumps. They can afford
they've
to
got
have
capital,
big,
they
powerful
can-
pumps, right?
exactly,
The more money you have, the more powerful your pump is,
Yeah.
the more water you can draw out quicker.
Right.
So it is a problem, but it's so on the particular point about adjudication. It's also interesting because Nestle has already been in court in Pakistan, right? So you have a Sindh High Court case,
Right.
and here again, the ways that it relates to one of the things we spoke about earlier was how the water issue or the water problem is entangled with all these other problems like land. Right. So I've spoken with lots of lawyers about this particular case, right? And some of them will say, "Oh, it wasn't really a water problem. It was really a land issue."
Okay.
Right. So the way that these resources become entangled, and then how these tensions play out in court.
Right.
And recently, we've actually seen a lot of. I mean, you've already spoken about the crowdfunding for the dam. So we've seen that there's a lot of court involvement in the water arena.
Yes.
And one of the other cases, which is also a recent case, is actually from the Lahore High Court. And one of the, so it's, I think it's the Asghar Laghari case where Justice Mansoor Ali Shah has this really interesting, he has these few paragraphs where he's, developing his notion of water justice.
Okay.
And if you contrast this jurisprudence, right, like what is coming from recently, what has come from the Supreme Court, what is the water crisis there versus what is the water crisis in some of these other more low-profile judgments.
Right.
There's, again, you see that spectrum.
Okay.
Because in this case, there's more talk of governance, distribution, maldistribution.
Right.
And here, more recently, it's just been this specter of, scarcity. We will become a desert.
Right. So let's build dams.
Right. So, but it's interesting here again that the question of the public here is, it's not just people deciding amongst themselves, for themselves, but it's very much one that involves formal institutions.
Yes. Yes. I was going to say, I remember when we were talking about this before our talk, you said, there was I want to make sure you talk about this. It's not just, and we'll get to our canal system, but our canal water is not just for agriculture. It turns out it's for more than agriculture, and even industrial use is part of it. And there are conflicts around that as well. And so I remember you talking about an industrial group and how they, so these powerful groups are able to kind of get their way. Do you want to comment on that?
So under the 1873 Canal and Drainage Act, and I'm, of course, speaking here I'm speaking about the Punjab Irrigation Department, right? Most of my research has been in the Lahore and Kasur areas, right? So a few years ago, I think this is 2 years ago, the department tries to raise the Abiyana. They try to raise the non-agriculture irrigation water rate.
Okay.
Right? And so it went up
So these are canals that are contributing water
Right.
to industrial use, and they wanted to increase the charge for that.
Yeah, so there's different rates. So for agricultural water use, there's a different rate,
Right.
and for industrial water
It's
use,
different,
there's
right.
So there's all kinds of actors that use this water, right?
Right.
Like cotton mills, textile, paper,
Right.
bleaching,
All
all
sorts of
these,
industry,
right?
right.
They have arrangements with they sign contracts with the irrigation department,
Okay,
right?
okay.
So what the irrigation department did was it raised the rate for these industrial units.
Okay.
And of course, these are powerful actors.
Right.
They have access to very good lawyers. They have a lot
Yes.
of money. So they went to court. They went to court and they basically said, it's interesting the wordings that were used. Some of the words they used were, this hike is whimsical, capricious, oppressive, right? So what's happened is that I think it's been over 2 years, and the issue
It's kind of stuck. It's in limbo,
stuck,
huh?
right? It's
Okay.
stuck because every time the department tries, the companies will go to court,
Okay.
and then the issue kind of stops. And then of course all these other bureaucratic temporalities also come in, right?
Right.
Like you might have one senior official in the irrigation department who's very committed to this cause.
Okay.
So he will pursue it. I think it's almost always a he, so I feel it's okay to say he.
Right.
So he will pursue it. Then there's a transfer.
Right.
And then the new person comes in, and
And maybe it's not
right.
their pet
It might
project
not
and-
be
yeah.
their thing.
Right.
So that's what's happening with this.
Right.
But I think it's important again to give importance to some of these to some of these cases, to see that it's because the perception, I think a wider perception is, oh, we're not really pricing, or we're not charging, or it's just free for all, right?
Right.
That these attempts are being made
Right.
by some of the same institutional actors that a
Right.
lot of people are always criticizing, and so
Right.
that so then I guess it falls to other people to see, well, where is it that where is the blockage?
Right.
How do you, or what do you do to sort of clear the
Clear
mess,
that.
so that
Yeah.
if something is happening, and if we are on board, I mean, many of us might not agree that this is a good thing.
Right.
How do we sort of push it forward?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's back to that second best world, right? What do you
Right,
do in
right,
this
right,
world
right,
where
yeah.
there's this reality, this institutional reality? It's I just want to, before I want to move us on to our
Right, yeah.
onto talking about water use in agriculture.
Right.
But I really like this thing that you just said about uncertainty, and the thing. So this is kind of this. My secret here is that I know somebody who's part of the. He owns a. He's one of the bottlers, and
Right,
he has a water business, and he said to me that like as long as there's a fair tax, we'll do it. But the uncertainty is terrible because you come in and you plan over these long horizons,
Right,
because you have to. When you got a big business, you got to plan on these long horizons, and then there's these capricious kind of changes, and then how do you proceed? And it kind of plays out in this domain of
Right.
water and